A man loses everything he's ever known in a small town. As he struggles to start over in the city, fate throws an unexpected event his way. He saves a life, but he could never predict how that act would change his own future. In this story filled with challenges, friendships, and second chances, everything is just beginning. Mark was a mechanic in a small town. He had taken over the workshop from his father and ran it for years with dedication and hard work. The workshop was more than just a place to fix cars and motorcycles, it was the heart of the town, a spot where people stopped by to chat and feel the warmth of friendly company. Mark worked from early morning until late at night, always pouring passion and responsibility into his craft. Everyone in town knew him as a reliable, helpful, and friendly guy. But sometimes, life has a way of shaking even the strongest foundations. That dreadful day was when everything started. As the sun was setting, Mark noticed smoke rising from the workshop. He ran inside and saw flames spreading rapidly. The fire must have started from an electrical fault. It was out of control in no time. The whole town quickly mobilized to help, hoses, buckets, anything they could find, but nothing seemed to work. Within minutes, the fire spread beyond the workshop and threatened a part of the town. Despite everyone's efforts, the flames consumed everything in their path. Mark stood there, helpless, watching his dreams go up in smoke. That workshop, a precious memory from his father, was turning to ashes right before his eyes. It wasn't just a source of income, it was his legacy. He had dedicated so much of his life to it, and now all of that effort was gone in an instant. By the time the fire was finally out, only piles of ash and debris remained. Mark stood silently in front of the charred wreckage for a long time, tears welling in his eyes. He realized he wouldn't be able to rebuild his old life here. The townsfolk tried to support him, but healing from this loss wasn't going to be easy. Years of effort and memories had been wiped out overnight. For a while Mark didn't know what to do. He spent sleepless nights searching for solutions, but his resources were limited. He didn't have enough money to start over in the town. Eventually he gathered the last of his savings and decided to move to the big city. Maybe leaving and starting fresh is for the best, he thought. Within a few weeks, Mark found a job in the city. He started working at a large factory. It wasn't the kind of job he could be passionate about, not like his workshop, but at least it was a new beginning. The noise and cold, mechanical atmosphere of the factory felt alien to him. Still, he needed to bring some structure back to his life. Every day he woke up early, went to work, and returned home late at night, exhausted. Occasionally he'd think about his hometown, the burned-down workshop, and the warmth of those familiar friendships, and his heart would ache. But he carried a small hope deep inside, that one day he'd build his life back up again. Mark's life at the factory had become filled with challenges. One day he was assigned to operate a machine he wasn't familiar with. Under the intense workload, he lost control, and one of the machine's parts moved quickly, hitting his arm. Mark fell to the ground, writhing in pain. His co-workers rushed over to help and immediately took him to the hospital. An X-ray revealed that his arm was broken. This incident shook Mark deeply. He was terrified that he might lose his job with a broken arm. However, the factory management didn't fire him. Instead, they assigned him to lighter duties. Still, going to work every day became an uphill battle for Mark. The cast on his arm caused constant pain and limited his movement. When they suggested he take some time off, he shook his head. "I can't take leave. I have to work. I need every penny I can earn," he said firmly. One night as he was leaving his shift, freezing rain mixed with snow started falling. Exhausted, Mark trudged through the wet streets, his clothes completely soaked. The cast on his arm absorbed the water, making the pain even worse. The cold pierced him to the bone. After walking for a while, he spotted a small diner by the side of the road. "Maybe I can warm up and get something to eat," he thought. But he hesitated, second-guessing himself. He had to be careful with his money. However, hunger and pain soon overpowered him, and he decided to go in and order a bowl of soup. While waiting for his soup, Mark glanced around the diner. It was quiet, with only a few customers. Then something caught his attention, a young woman sitting in the corner. She had long, wavy hair draped over her shoulders. As she sipped her coffee, she kept glancing anxiously out the window. There was a visible fear in her eyes, and she gripped the edge of the table tightly. After a moment, she straightened up, took a deep breath, and hurriedly pulled out some crumpled bills from her pocket. She placed them on the table, stood up, and quickly headed for the door. Mark found her behavior odd and a little intriguing, but he didn't dwell on it. After finishing his soup, he paid the bill and stepped back out onto the wet streets. A little while later, as he walked down a side alley, he froze in place. The woman from the diner was there, being forced into a car by several men. They looked menacing and she was struggling desperately trying to push them away. Mark hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. He glanced down at the cast on his arm and took a deep, pained breath. I can't take them on, he thought. But there was no way he could just walk away. He quickly pulled out his phone and called the police, giving them the location. There's a woman here being forced into a car. Please hurry, he said urgently. The police were still nowhere in sight, and the woman's situation was getting worse by the second. She was gasping for breath, saying something to the men. She held her hands up defensively and took cautious steps back. I told you I don't want to see you, she shouted, her voice a mix of fear and anger. But the men ignored her words. One of them sneered, "You don't get to make demands," and took a threatening step forward. Another man grabbed her arm roughly. Her scream echoed through the street. Let me go. Help me. Mark watched in horror from a distance, hesitating as he looked down at the cast on his arm. What can I do? I don't stand a chance against them in this condition, he thought. But his conscience wouldn't let him walk away. The woman's desperate cries rang in his ears. The men were now dragging her toward the car. It was time to make a decision. Mark took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. Hey, what do you think you're doing? Let her go now, he shouted, stepping into the street. His voice echoed sharply through the cold air. The men froze for a moment, turning their eyes toward him in surprise. The brief pause quickly turned into a tense, hostile silence. Who the hell are you? Get lost, one of the men yelled, narrowing his eyes and starting to walk toward Mark with a threatening stance. Mark swallowed hard but tried to push down his fear. She doesn't want to go with you. Let her go, he said firmly. The men exchanged glances. One of them smirked and walked closer to Mark. What are you going to do about it? A guy with a busted arm thinks he can stop us, he taunted, laughing. Mark didn't back down. You think I'm scared of you? He said, standing his ground. Just then one of the men lunged forward and threw a punch. It landed hard, sending Mark stumbling to the snow-covered ground. He felt a sharp pain in his face but quickly tried to recover. As he struggled to get back up, another man shoved him down again. We don't have time for this, one of them snapped, motioning to the other. Take care of him. They continued their assault, punches and kicks hitting Mark from all directions. The pain in his arm became unbearable, each blow intensifying the agony. Yet he refused to give up. He tried to move toward the woman. Leave her alone, he shouted, only to be knocked down again by another blow. The woman screamed, Stop it. That's enough. She tried to intervene but they pushed her aside. In the scuffle, she lost her balance and hit her head on the car door, collapsing to the ground. Mark's eyes widened in shock as he watched her fall. She lay still. No, she's unconscious, he whispered, panic rising in his chest. Driven by instinct, he crawled toward her, ignoring the pain that racked his body. The men started to panic too. Suddenly, the distant sound of police sirens echoed through the street. Red and blue lights flashed, growing brighter as the patrol cars approached. Shit. The cops, one of the men shouted. In a frenzy, they abandoned the car and bolted into the darkness. Mark trembled in pain as he reached the woman. He gently touched her face, checking for a pulse. Hang on. Help is coming, he whispered softly. She was breathing but she remained unconscious. Finally, police cars arrived at the scene. Officers quickly stepped out, scanning the area as Mark let out a shaky breath of relief. He glanced at the woman's face and felt a wave of calm wash over him. Just in time, he muttered. Help was finally here. As Mark and the woman lay motionless on the ground, police officers quickly rushed to their side. One of the officers noticed that Mark's consciousness was fading. Another officer immediately radioed for an ambulance. Both of them are in bad shape. They need urgent medical attention, he said while checking the wounds on Mark's face. The medics carefully placed the woman on a stretcher and then carried Mark into the ambulance as well. On the way, Mark's eyes started to slowly close. The sound of sirens and the paramedics' voices became more and more distant. Hospital. Cost. How am I going to pay for this? He thought before losing consciousness completely. When he opened his eyes in the hospital, the bright white lights on the ceiling dazzled him. It took him a moment to figure out where he was. The pain from his bandaged arm quickly reminded him. A nurse stood by his side. You're awake. The doctor will be here soon, she said kindly. A short while later, the doctor arrived and explained Mark's condition. Mark, you've taken a serious hit. Your broken arm has worsened from the strain, so it's going to take more time to heal. You'll need to rest for at least a few days. You absolutely can't work during this time, the doctor said firmly. Mark's face tightened and a wave of worry washed over him. If I can't work for a few days, they'll cut my pay. I'm already barely getting by, he thought anxiously. Lowering his voice, he muttered, but I have to work. The doctor shook his head with understanding. If you push yourself before you heal, you'll only make things worse. Give this report to your employer. Also, you need to take the prescribed medications regularly, the doctor said, handing Mark the prescription. Mark let out a deep sigh. He had no choice. After being discharged, he stopped by the pharmacy on his way out of the hospital. As he picked up the medication, his eyes drifted to the total amount on the receipt. He mentally calculated his remaining money. These costs are going to ruin me. Can I get better without these meds? He wondered, but the memory of the doctor's serious tone stopped him. He paid for the medicine and quietly stepped outside. The cold city air hit his face as he made his way home. He carried 2 bags of medication, each step growing heavier with worry. How am I going to pay the rent? And there's still the electric bill. By the time he reached his apartment, he was completely drained. He slipped off his shoes and placed the bags on the table. Taking out his phone, he called the factory. I wanted to update you about my situation, he said to the person on the line. I'll bring in my hospital report tomorrow. I've been advised to rest for a few days, he added. The person on the other end told him to bring the report and to focus on recovering. Mark hung up and slowly made his way to his bed. His body ached all over, but the worries in his mind caused him even more pain. I won't be able to work for a while. How long is this going to last? He thought as he lay down. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him. As his eyes closed, a deep, quiet darkness surrounded him, pulling him into a heavy sleep. Mark was jolted out of his deep sleep by a loud, forceful knocking on his door. His heart started pounding rapidly. Who could it be at this hour? He got out of bed and peeked out the window, his eyes landing on a sleek black luxury car parked outside. Panic immediately surged through him. Is it those guys from last night? He thought fearfully. His hands began to tremble. Not answering the door seemed like a solution, but what if something worse happened? The knocking came again, but this time it was gentler. What am I going to do? He muttered to himself. Taking a deep breath, he tried to suppress his fear. There was no way to escape. With shaky fingers, he slowly reached for the door lock. Mark took a deep breath and, with trembling hands, opened the door. Standing there was a man in a black suit, his face serious and expressionless. There was an air of authority in his posture. He gave a slight nod and spoke. Our boss would like to speak with you, he said calmly. Mark froze for a moment. Your boss? Who? He asked, his voice shaking slightly. The man's response was short and direct. You're Mark, right? You were involved in an incident last night. Our boss wants to have a word with you. Mark's heart began to race. His eyes widened as panic slowly crept in. I don't want to go, he said nervously. Thoughts of worst-case scenarios flashed through his mind. What if they beat me up again? He wondered fearfully. The man, without showing any sign of aggression, simply stood there in patient silence. Mark inhaled deeply, realizing there was no way out. Okay. Fine, he finally muttered, as if reluctantly surrendering. The man gestured politely toward the car. Mark hesitantly stepped inside, feeling a subtle tension in the air. The driver and the suited man sat with him, both serious but polite. However, they gave him no answers to his questions. The man spoke only in short, formal replies, offering no details. As Mark stared out the window, the tension in his chest grew tighter. What's going on? He thought anxiously. The car moved quietly through the streets, the only sound being the low hum of the engine. The man's calm yet distant demeanor only heightened Mark's unease. As Mark gazed silently out the window, his eyes widened in disbelief. It was as if he had entered a completely different world. The cityscape gradually gave way to an area filled with luxurious villas and grand mansions surrounded by expansive gardens. Magnificent structures, large iron gates, and long driveways lined the road. Who lives here? He wondered, scanning his surroundings in shock. The car finally stopped in front of an enormous mansion. The man in the black suit stepped out and politely opened the door for Mark. Please follow me, he said in a courteous yet authoritative tone. Mark took a deep breath and cautiously stepped out of the car. A thin layer of snow blanketed the large stone steps leading up to the mansion. As he raised his head, he saw the structure looming majestically against the dark sky. With each step, his tension grew. The suited man opened the large door and gestured for Mark to enter. Mark hesitantly walked inside. The interior of the mansion was even more impressive. High ceilings, gleaming marble floors, and massive crystal chandeliers surrounded him. He was momentarily captivated by the sheer opulence. A servant approached and spoke softly, "Please come with me." Mark followed the servant in silence. They ascended a grand staircase and walked through a long corridor until they finally reached a large bedroom door. The door opened and Mark's eyes scanned the room. It was even more luxurious than the rest of the mansion. Outside the tall windows, snow fell gently, creating a scene that looked like a painting. In the center of the room, an elderly man lay in a large bed, connected to 4 drips and medical equipment. Mark swallowed nervously, his anxiety intensifying. What is going on here? He thought to himself. The silence in the room felt heavy. The elderly man slowly turned his head and looked at Mark. His eyes carefully studied the cast on Mark's arm and the bruises on his face. He observed him quietly for a few moments before finally speaking in a deep, yet steady voice. You're the man who saved my daughter," he said, his eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and gratitude. Mark's heart began to race. His daughter? What is he talking about? He wondered. At that moment, it hit him, the woman he had rescued was this man's daughter. His breath caught in his throat as the realization sank in. He stood there, frozen in shock, never having imagined such a connection. Mark remained silent as the elderly man kept his eyes fixed on him and began to speak slowly. "My daughter and I had a terrible argument and she left the house. I searched for her everywhere. But she got herself into trouble. My enemies found her. If you hadn't intervened that night, they would have killed her," he said, his voice trembling. The memories of that night flashed through Mark's mind. Only now did he fully grasp the seriousness of the danger the woman had been in. In shock he mumbled, "They were going to kill her?" The man nodded slowly. "Yes. But because of you they didn't. You saved my daughter's life that night. Thanks to you she's safe now," he said sincerely. Mark swallowed hard. I just did what I had to do. Anyone would have done the same," he said, his voice shaking. It felt strange to him to be at the center of something so important. The elderly man took a deep breath and continued, "I apologize if I frightened you, but I had to meet you. I see the injuries you suffered while protecting my daughter. Your arm. The wounds on your face." His eyes glistened with emotion. "Tell me, what can I do for you? Please." "I owe you," he added as tears began to roll down his cheeks. Mark hesitated, averting his eyes. "Please sir, just focus on your health. I didn't do this expecting anything in return," he said softly. But the man insisted. "I can't forget this kindness, Mark. Let me do something for you," he said earnestly. Mark took a deep breath, trying to relax a little. The gratitude in the man's eyes moved him. Finally, unable to hold back, he began to share his story. "I was a mechanic in a small town. I ran a workshop that had been passed down from my father. Until a fire destroyed everything. Now I work at a factory in the city, but life has been really hard." The man listened quietly and nodded. "I will help you rebuild the workshop and the homes that were damaged in your town. This burden won't rest solely on your shoulders anymore," he said with determination. Mark's eyes widened. "Really? You would do that?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Of course," the man replied with a gentle smile. "You deserve this." The next day, Mark returned to his town with the elderly man's assistants and a construction team. Reconstruction began on the burned houses and his workshop. Workers were everywhere and the town slowly came back to life. The townspeople welcomed Mark warmly, their eyes filled with hope and gratitude. As the days passed, Mark often met with the elderly man, who repeatedly told him how proud he was. During one of their visits, the man spoke to Mark seriously. "Mark, you need to leave the factory job. You need time to rest and heal. Until your workshop is ready, take this check and live on it. Please, I ask this as a favor," he said. Mark hesitated at first but finally accepted after the man's gentle insistence. He quit his job and took some time to recover. Gradually, the workshop was rebuilt, even better than before. On opening day, the entire town gathered to celebrate, hugging one another in joy. During the ceremony, Mark gave a short speech. "This workshop isn't just mine. It's a second chance for all of us. Life is full of challenges, but if you have the right people by your side, anything is possible," he said. Applause erupted around him as Mark smiled with deep peace in his heart. The scars of the past had finally healed. He had found a new beginning, and a bright future awaited him in his workshop. Mark often visited the wealthy man and his daughter. In every meeting, the man expressed his gratitude, reminding Mark that kindness should never be forgotten. One day during a visit, Mark shook the elderly man's hand and looked him in the eyes. "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have been able to return here." "I owe you my thanks," Mark said sincerely. The man smiled warmly in response. "Throughout life we sometimes meet the right people, Mark. You're one of those people. You gave us hope. Kindness always comes full circle, and it will find its way back to you," he said. Mark had now shed the burdens of his past and was living a happy life in his hometown. The difficult days at the factory and the worries he had in the hospital were all behind him. Now he was a respected man working in his workshop, serving his town, and surrounded by friends and loyal customers. He had truly found a fresh start. As light snow began to fall, Mark stood in front of his workshop and gazed up at the sky. No matter how hard life gets, there's always a way forward, he thought to himself. For Mark, this wasn't an ending, it was the beginning of a new chapter. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Share your thoughts with us in the comments and support us with a super like. See you in the next story.